for the ones who grieve in silence, and the ones brave enough to witness it. The morning fog rolled in off the Po River like it had somewhere important to be, curling around the stone ankles of Turin's older buildings, softening the edges of a city that was never quite soft. Valentina Greco stood behind the counter of Fiori di Sera, flowers of the evening, and watched the fog the way she watched most things, quietly, without demanding anything from it. The shop was narrow, the way all the best Turin shops were narrow, tucked between a jeweller who never opened before noon and a bakery that had been there since 1943. Valentina had inherited the lease from her grandmother, along with the copper watering can, the particular trick of conditioning roses in lukewarm water, and the belief that flowers were not decoration. They were language. Every arrangement was a sentence. Every bloom chosen was a word that the buyer either couldn't or wouldn't say aloud. She was 28 years old and had been speaking this language since she was 6. The bell above the door chimed at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning in November, which was unusual. November was not a month for impulse purchases. It was grey and serious, a month that asked things of you. Her usual Tuesday customers, the woman who bought sunflowers for her kitchen table every week without fail, the elderly professor who sent violets to his wife on the anniversary of their first date, they came later, after 9, after coffee had done its work on the city. The man who walked through the door was not one of her usual customers. She knew this immediately, the way you know certain things before you've had time to think them through. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", wearing a coat that was simple in cut but unmistakably expensive, the kind of simplicity that costs more than complication. Dark hair, well kept, clean-shaven. He wasn't young, exactly, but he wasn't old. He existed in that particular register of a man in his mid to late 30s who had lived a great deal and showed only the finest of it in his face. He wore no ring. She noticed this not because she was looking, but because his hands were visible. He carried nothing, no phone, no bag, and hands were one of the things she always noticed. Her grandmother had taught her that. Hands tell you everything, Valentina. The rest of a person can be arranged. "Buongiorno," she said. He said nothing immediately. He looked around the shop with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not wonder, not assessment, something more careful than both. "I need flowers," he said, in Italian that was precise and unaccented, not Turinese, not Roman, neutral in the way that people who have lived many places become neutral. "For a funeral." "Of course." She came around the counter. "When is the service?" 3 days. "And the deceased, were they someone who loved any particular flower? Sometimes family members." "There is no family," he said, not coldly, just as a fact, delivered with the straightforwardness of someone who had long since made peace with facts. "It is a private burial, very private. I need the arrangement to be significant." Not decorative, significant. Valentina studied him for a moment. What was the person like? Something shifted in his expression. It was minute, a fraction of a degree in the angle of his jaw, a slight compression at the corners of his mouth. But she had spent her entire life reading the small language of emotion that people allowed into their faces when they thought no one was paying close enough attention. "Strong," he said. "Stubborn. A man who had—" He paused. A man who had done things in his life that required a particular kind of courage. Whether that courage was always admirable is a separate matter. It was an unusual answer for a flower shop, but Valentina had learned long ago that flower shops were confession booths with better lighting. "White lilies," she said. "For the strength, and dark red roses, not for romance, but for the depth of a life fully committed to its own purposes. Evergreen branches for permanence, and I'd suggest a single branch of olive for peace, even for lives that didn't know much of it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way people almost never did in public spaces, the way that could feel either threatening or like a kind of recognition, depending on who was doing it. "Yes," he said, "that. How many arrangements, and where should they be delivered?" He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew an envelope. It was cream-coloured, thick. He set it on the counter between them. "This covers the cost and the delivery. I'll write the address inside. You'll find it." He paused. "I would ask that you bring them yourself, not a delivery service." Valentina glanced at the envelope. "We don't usually— I am aware this is an unusual request." He met her eyes again. "The price is unusual also." She opened the envelope. The cash inside was not what she usually found in flower envelopes. It was not the crisp 50s her wedding clients tucked inside with thank-you notes. It was bundled neatly, and it was several times what the arrangement would cost. "There's a card inside," he said, "with the address." She found it. The address was written in handwriting that was controlled and angular, not calligraphic, but precise. A cemetery she recognized, on the southern outskirts of the city, in a private section she had delivered to before, once, years ago, for a client she had never seen again. When she looked up, he was already turning toward the door. "What name should I put on the arrangement?" she called. He stopped. His hand was on the door. He didn't turn around. "No name," he said. "Just the flowers." The bell chimed again, and he was gone. Valentina stood in the middle of her shop, holding an envelope of cash and a card with an address for a nameless funeral, the fog still pressing its grey face against the window. She should have called someone. Looking back, later, she would think this often. She should have called her cousin Marco, who was a notary and liked to be consulted about unusual situations. She should have, at the very minimum, done a small internet search for the cemetery address and the date. Instead, she went to the back room and began selecting lilies. She worked through the morning in the particular silence she loved best. The silence of creation, of hands doing what they knew. The lilies came from the refrigerated back room where she kept her best stock, not the showy oriental variety that screamed their presence across a room, but the quieter, older calla lilies, whose elegance was architectural rather than performative. Their white was the white of old marble. She trimmed the stems at an angle, the way her grandmother had shown her, because flowers drink better when the cut is clean and diagonal. More surface area, more life absorbed. The dark red roses she chose from the Thursday delivery, the ones that had been conditioning for 2 days and were now at precisely the right stage of openness, not tight-budded and closed, not too full, not yet dropping petals. The roses of the moment just before the peak, which was, she had always thought, the most honest moment of anything beautiful. She found herself thinking about the man as she worked, not romantically, or not only romantically, if she was being honest with herself, which she usually was in the privacy of the back room. She thought about the way he had described the deceased. A man who had done things that required a particular kind of courage. Whether that courage was always admirable is a separate matter. It was the kind of thing you said about a soldier, or a father, or a man who had lived in complicated circumstances and managed to retain some thread of his own moral compass through all of it. It was also, she realized now, the kind of thing you said when you were grieving but couldn't fully say so. She thought about his hands again, the way they had rested at his sides, controlled, still, the way a person holds themselves still when stillness is an achievement rather than a default. She had known men like that. Her own father, before the illness, had had that quality. Men who had decided at some point that what they felt would not be legible on the outside of their bodies. Men who had made that decision so long ago that they could barely feel the effort of it anymore. The city was slowly waking up around her. She could hear the bakery next door, the particular rhythm of the morning rush, the briefest of conversations over cornetti and cappuccino, the sound of the espresso machine doing its reliable percussion. Through the shop's front window, she watched Turin shuffle past in its November coats, the collar-up, eyes-down shuffle of a northern Italian city that takes its winters seriously. Her assistant, Julia, arrived at 9:30, unwinding a long scarf from around her neck and immediately noticing the envelope on the counter. "What's that?" "A commission," Valentina said. "Private funeral. I'm delivering it myself Thursday morning." Julia picked up the envelope, felt its weight, and set it down without opening it. She was 22, practical in the way of people who grew up without much, and she had a reliable instinct for when to ask questions and when not to. She looked at Valentina's face now and made the right call. "Do you need me to cover the Thursday morning?" "Please. The Fontana wedding order comes in Thursday afternoon. I'll be back by noon." Julia nodded and went to hang up her coat without saying anything else, which was one of the things Valentina appreciated most about her. The arrangement came together over 2 days. She worked at it in the spaces between customers. The Sunflower Woman, on time as always, with a story about her sister's new apartment, 2 birthday arrangements for a corporate account, a sympathy piece for a Signora Almondo whose husband had passed, a last-minute request for a dinner-table centerpiece from a restaurant on Via Lagrange, who always ordered too late and paid without complaint. But the nameless funeral arrangement, that one she worked with something approaching reverence. She added the olive branch on the 2nd day, having found exactly the right one from a supplier she used for unusual botanicals, a small old man in the Porta Palazzo market, who had been growing olives in pots on a Piemontese balcony for 40 years, and who handed over the branch with the gravity of someone parting with something irreplaceable. She wove in the evergreen, a dark, textured juniper, and let the lilies anchor the arrangement's height, the roses filling the middle with their deep, unsentimental colour. She added nothing frivolous, no baby's breath, no filler, nothing that was there to take up space. The arrangement was exactly what it was, a sentence in her grandmother's language. Here was a life. It had weight. It mattered. Someone mourns it. She was wrapping it in brown paper and dark ribbon Thursday morning, an hour before she needed to leave, when her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. Turin area code. She answered. The florist. It wasn't a question. She recognized the voice immediately, that same neutral precision, slightly lower on the phone than in person. "Yes?" "You'll bring the flowers today." "I was already planning to," she said. "The address you left." A pause. "You'll come alone." She should have found this alarming. The part of her brain that had been raised on cautionary sense, on her mother's steady list of things sensible women did not do, registered it as a yellow flag, a thing to be noted. But his voice, under the control of it, had something she couldn't name. A heaviness that wasn't aggression, something closer to exhaustion. The heaviness of someone who had been carrying something for a very long time. "I'll come alone," she said. Another pause. Then, "Thank you." He hung up before she could respond. She stood holding her phone, the completed arrangement wrapped and waiting on the counter, and she made a decision that would change the entire architecture of her life. She put on her good coat, picked up the flowers, and went to deliver them. The cemetery existed at the edge of the city, the way old sadness exists at the edges of memory. Present, familiar, not quite part of the daily landscape, but never entirely absent from it. Valentina drove her small white van through the November streets, the arrangement secured in the back, in the padded carrier she used for deliveries requiring extra care. The radio played something classical, the kind of thing her grandmother had loved, violin forward and autumnal, and the sound felt appropriate to the morning and what it was asking of her. The private section of the cemetery was accessed through a side gate, iron and heavy, with a keypad whose code she had been given in a text message. No context, no explanation, 20 minutes after the phone call. She punched in the numbers, and the gate swung open silently, which told her something about who maintained this place. The graves here were older on average, the stones more substantial. Private burial ground, she knew, was rare and expensive in Italian cities. The kind of people who had plots here were not ordinary Turinese. They were families who had existed for generations in the particular Turin way, through industry, through banking, through the older, less documented kinds of commerce that the city's long history of discretion made possible. She carried the arrangement along the gravel path, her breath visible in the cold air. There was no sound here except the faint, far-away sound of the city. A truck somewhere, a church bell beginning its slow count toward 10. She found the grave by following the only fresh-turned earth in the section. A rectangular wound in the grass, dark and precise. The headstone was already in place, which surprised her. Usually it took weeks after burial for the stone to be set. This one was granite, simple, bearing a name she read and then paused on. Antonio Ferrante, 1949 to 2024. He did what was required. She stood very still. The epitaph was not affectionate. It was not religious, not poetic. It was a kind of brutal honesty that struck her as, paradoxically, one of the most loving things she had ever read on a gravestone. Because it was true. It was precisely true, in the way that only someone who had known and loved the person deeply could have chosen. She was still reading it when she heard him. Not footsteps, she heard nothing so concrete. She became aware of him, the way you become aware of weather, of a change in atmospheric pressure. She turned. He was standing 10 feet away at the edge of the gravel path, wearing the same coat as the day he'd come to the shop. He was looking at the grave. His face was... She had worked in flowers for 22 years and had therefore witnessed human grief in almost every form it took. The dry grief of the exhausted who had been watching someone die for months and had run out of tears before the ending came. The loud grief of the surprised, people who had not had time to prepare. the grey, stunned grief of the very young. What she saw on his face was none of these precisely. It was something older than all of them. He was weeping silently. Not crying. There was a distinction, and she had always understood it. Crying was active. It demanded witness. It moved through you in waves you rode. Weeping was different. Weeping was the thing that happened when grief had been held under enormous pressure for a very long time, and finally, in a moment of privacy, found a single hairline crack through which to escape. 2 tracks of moisture, precise as brushstrokes, moving down a face that was otherwise completely still. He was not aware of her. She should have set the flowers down quietly and retreated. She knew this. The professional thing, the decent thing, was to place the arrangement, back away without disrupting this moment that was not meant for her eyes, and leave. She didn't. She stood and watched him grieve, held absolutely still by something she couldn't name, not prurience, not fascination in any cheap sense, something more like witness. The same instinct that made her, as a child, sit with dying flowers in the back room rather than throw them away, because she believed that things deserved to be seen to the end. He became aware of her. It happened gradually. She saw the moment he felt her presence, saw the recalibration that moved through him fast and practiced, the way a man with certain skills could compose himself in the space of 3 seconds and emerge looking entirely different than he had looked before. He turned. His face was dry. The grief had been folded up and put away somewhere internal. What looked at her now was the man who had come into her shop, controlled, precise, those dark eyes that gave nothing away. "You came," he said. "I did." She held out the arrangement. "I'm sorry to intrude. I was just going to leave these." He crossed the distance between them and took the flowers from her hands. His fingers brushed hers, brief, accidental, and something moved through her that she chose, immediately and firmly, not to examine. He turned to the grave and lowered himself to one knee on the cold grass, setting the arrangement against the headstone with a care that was almost ceremonial. He stayed that way for a long moment, one hand still touching the edge of the flowers, his head slightly bowed. Valentina watched him and felt, very precisely, the thing that her grandmother had always warned her about. The dangerous ones are the ones who feel deeply and show it only when they think no one is looking, because then you have seen something real and you can never unsee it, and they can never forgive you for it, or they can never stop wanting you for it, which is worse. She stood in the November cold of a cemetery at the edge of Turin, and she understood her grandmother's warning for the first time. He rose from his knee and turned to face her. "The flowers are exactly right," he said. "The olive branch was for peace," she said, because she felt she should explain herself. "Even for lives that—" "I know," he said. "I know what it meant." A silence. "Who was he?" she asked, and immediately felt the intrusion of the question, the way it landed between them. He looked at her for a long, assessing moment. "My father," he said. Then he said nothing more, and neither did she, and they stood together in the quiet of that private cemetery, while the city went about its complicated, indifferent business beyond the iron fence. His name was Luca. She didn't learn it that day, he didn't offer it, and she didn't ask again, because she had already asked one question that felt like too much, and he had answered it, and she understood that she had been given something finite, a certain number of words, and she didn't want to spend them all at once. She learned his name 4 days later, when he came back to the shop. It was late afternoon, the light in Turin already doing its winter disappearing act, dropping below the roofline an hour before it should. She was alone. Julia had left at 4, and she was closing out the register when the bell chimed and he walked in. He looked different in this light, which was the amber half-light of late afternoon through a window full of flowers, and different also in some quality of his presence, slightly less controlled, she thought, or perhaps controlled in a slightly different way, as if the precision of the cemetery had relaxed 1 degree. "The shop is about to close," she said, because it was true, and because she felt she needed to say something. "I know." He looked around the shop, at the flowers, at the arrangement she'd been building for tomorrow's opening display. "I wanted to thank you for the arrangements and for—" He paused, considered. "For staying." She hadn't been aware, until he said this, that he'd known she was there before he turned around. She had assumed, in the way she always assumed such things, that his awareness of her had come when his eyes found her. Now she revised that. He had known the moment she'd stopped walking. "You're welcome," she said. "I'm sorry about your father." He nodded. "My name is Luca Ferrante." She came around the counter and offered her hand, because it seemed right, because this was still a business transaction of a kind, an unusual one, but still. "Valentina Greco." She shook his hand once, brief and definite, and she noticed again the quality of his hands, strong in the particular way of hands that have done physical things, knuckles that had at some point been broken and healed with minimal fuss. He released her hand. "Ferrante," she said, "like the headstone." Like the headstone. She had, in the 4 days since the cemetery, looked up the name. She was a sensible person, and she lived in Turin, and she had not been entirely naive about what kind of money paid for a private section of a cemetery and a cash-in envelope flower order from a stranger. The Ferrante family. She had found enough, in the careful way of a person who knows that some information is dangerous and reads only what is offered rather than digging. A name associated with import and export businesses, a name associated with certain neighbourhoods in Turin's western districts, a name that appeared obliquely in a newspaper archive from 2017 in connection with a police investigation that had ultimately led nowhere. A name that meant something specific in this city, to people who paid attention. "You know who we are," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know something," she said, "not everything. Knowing something is often enough." He looked at her steadily. "Are you frightened?" She considered. "No. Should I be?" Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. Not warm, exactly. The architecture of his face didn't seem built for warmth, or perhaps had been rebuilt somewhere along the way to exclude it. But something. A recognition. "Most people would be," he said. "Most people don't know you're grieving your father." The almost smile again, and this time it reached his eyes for just a fraction of a second before it retreated. "No," he said, "most people don't." He bought a small arrangement. She wouldn't have predicted this, but then she was realizing that Luca Ferrante was not a predictable man. He chose it himself, moving through the shop with a deliberateness that suggested he was looking at the flowers rather than just looking, that he was seeing them as she had trained herself to see them. He chose an arrangement she had made earlier, eucalyptus and white freesia, and a single stem of dark calla lily, spare and fragrant. "Who is it for?" she asked, wrapping it. "My apartment," he said. "It's been empty for a while." He paid in cash, of course, and left with the flowers tucked under his arm, and Valentina stood in her closing shop and thought about a man who had been grieving in a cemetery and who now carried flowers home to an empty apartment. And she felt the particular, dangerous thing that her grandmother had warned her about settling deeper into her chest, like something taking root. She locked the door. She told herself firmly that it was professional admiration, that she was moved by grief because grief was her industry, because she had lived her entire life in the proximity of it. She told herself this several times and believed it slightly less each time. He came back a week later, and then again the week after that. The second time he bought nothing. He asked her a question about orchids, whether they could survive a north-facing window, which was a question so ordinary and domestic that she almost laughed and managed not to. And they talked for 20 minutes about plant light and exposure and the particular stubbornness of orchids, which were either indestructible or impossible, depending entirely on circumstances she had never been able to fully predict. "You talk about plants the way people talk about temperamental people," he observed. "They are temperamental people," she said. "They have preferences. They communicate. You just have to learn the language." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. He was wearing a different coat today, charcoal, longer, and he looked very deliberately out of place in her narrow shop of flowers and fragrance, a large, dark thing surrounded by delicate, living colour, and the contrast felt intentional in a way she couldn't articulate. "And the languages?" he prompted. "Leaves, mostly. The angle of them, whether they're reaching or retracting, whether the colour is right or slightly wrong. Plants tell you everything. You just have to stop making assumptions about what you want to hear." She paused. "Same as people, really." He looked at her with that measuring quality again. "You read people." "I read arrangements. The people come with them." "What do you read in mine?" She met his eyes directly. "You came 3 times in 2 weeks to a flower shop. You don't have plants at home. You asked about the orchid as if it was a foreign concept, which means the freesia was probably the first living thing you've kept in your apartment in some time. You're not here for flowers." A pause. Something shifted in the careful landscape of his expression. "No," he said. "I'm not here for flowers." "Then what are you here for?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the arrangement she was working on, peonies and dusty miller for a birthday delivery, and he seemed to be considering the question with genuine attention, as if it deserved thought rather than performance. "Quiet," he said at last. "This is a very quiet place." She understood this completely. The shop was quiet. It had always been quiet, even on busy days. The flowers absorbed sound, or maybe created a kind of frequency that human noise couldn't penetrate. Her grandmother had said that plants were praying constantly, and that was why it was quiet near them. "You can come for quiet," she said. "The shop is open until 6. He came back that Thursday, and again on Saturday, and in this way a pattern established itself, tentative and unacknowledged, like a path worn in grass by repeated walking, not a decision exactly, but the result of several small decisions accumulating. She learned things about him in increments. He had grown up in Turin, but had spent years in the United States, New York, Chicago, Miami, and had returned to Italy 3 years ago. The accent she had classified as neutral was the result of this. Italian, overlaid with English, overlaid with the particular discipline of a man who had trained himself out of regionalism, the way soldiers trained themselves out of civilian habits. His father, Antonio Ferrante, had run the family's operations for 30 years. What those operations precisely entailed, she did not ask, and he did not say. But she was not a fool. She had grown up in Turin. She knew that certain families held their prosperity the way old buildings held their foundations. The visible structure was respectable, admirable even, and the underground part was not discussed in public. Luca was the eldest son. There was a brother, younger, named Matteo, whom he mentioned once and did not elaborate on, except to say, with a precision that managed to contain worlds of complicated feeling, "Matteo is not like me." She told him about her grandmother, Nonna Carla, who had opened the shop in 1978 and who had believed with complete conviction that you could say anything with flowers if you chose them correctly. She told him about learning to condition roses at the age of 6, about the first arrangement she had ever built entirely alone, birds of paradise and holly for a Christmas display, that her grandmother had hung in the window without changing a single stem. "She sounds formidable," Luca said. "Terrifying," Valentina agreed. "Completely, gently terrifying. She never raised her voice in her life. She never needed to." "I understand that kind of power," he said, and she believed him. She had still not been to wherever he lived. She had not been asked. This was appropriate and professional and correct in every way she could enumerate, and she enumerated them often in the privacy of her apartment in the evenings, particularly on the days she'd seen him, when she lay awake, cataloguing the exact quality of his silences and the way he looked at things with the focused patience of a man who had learned that most things revealed themselves if you simply waited. She was, she admitted to herself on one such evening, in some reasonable amount of trouble. The invitation came on a Wednesday, delivered not by Luca himself, but by a young man in a dark suit who appeared at the shop's door at exactly 5:30 and handed her an envelope, cream, thick, the same stock as the first one, with a gravity that suggested he was accustomed to delivering envelopes whose contents mattered. Inside was a card, handwritten in that same controlled, angular script. "Saturday evening, 8 o'clock. Dress for dinner. Address on the other side. L." She turned the card over. An address on Piazza Castello, one of Turin's most central squares, a stone's throw from the Palazzo Reale. She knew the building. It was the kind of building that had once been a palazzo in the literal sense and had since been converted to high-end apartments that preserved all the historical bones while installing the kind of systems that made comfort invisible. A penthouse, presumably. The address had a floor number that corresponded to the building's highest habitable level. She put the card in her coat pocket and finished closing the shop and walked home through the cold evening streets, and she did not immediately make a decision. She gave herself the evening to think, because she was 28 and sensible, and she knew that certain invitations, once accepted, could not be unaccepted. She thought about what Luca Ferrante was. She was not naive about this. The cash payments, the private cemetery, the way the young man in the suit had appeared precisely at 5:30 with precisely the right envelope. These were the details of a life organized according to systems that operated outside the ordinary ones. She was a florist in Turin. He was whatever he was in Turin. The difference in their landscapes was significant, and she was smart enough to know it. She thought about him on his knee in the cemetery, one hand on the flowers, his head bowed over his father's grave. She accepted. Saturday came in the way November Saturdays came in Turin. Pewter sky, cold that had decided to mean it, the piazzas showing only their most essential population. She spent the morning in the shop, then the afternoon in the particular productive anxiety of a woman getting ready for something she knew she was not entirely prepared for. She wore a dress she had bought in a moment of optimism the previous spring and hadn't found an occasion for. Dark green velvet, simple enough to be elegant, specific enough to be intentional. She wore her grandmother's gold earrings, which were her good luck charm and her armour. The building on Piazza Castello had a doorman who was waiting for her. He took her name, confirmed it against something in his earpiece, and escorted her to the private elevator. The elevator had no buttons visible from the outside. He used the key card and said, "The top floor, signorina," and she rode up in silence, watching her own reflection in the mirrored doors. The elevator opened directly into the apartment. She had been in fine apartments before. Turin was a wealthy city, and her wedding and corporate clients occupied buildings that testified to this. She had never been in a space quite like this one. It was large in the way that spoke of wealth so established it didn't need to assert itself. Ceilings that were almost certainly original 16th century plasterwork, now immaculately preserved. Floors of dark oak, old and deep-grained. The furniture was spare, intentionally so, she thought, rather than from any absence of means. A few pieces of real quality, a leather sofa the colour of cognac, a long table of dark wood, artwork that was not the kind she could identify, but clearly not the kind purchased for investment. Floor-to-ceiling windows on the south-facing wall looked out over the entire city, the ochre and sienna roofline, the mountains visible even in evening, the Alps white-capped and indifferent at the horizon. Luca was waiting by the windows. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, the collar of his shirt open 2 buttons in a way that was neither studied nor careless. He turned when she stepped out of the elevator, and she had the distinct and immediate sensation of his full attention landing on her. Not just seeing her, but regarding her with the careful precision he brought to everything. "You came," he said, and she heard the echo of the cemetery, the same words, the same slight quality of something released. "I told you I would." "People tell me things they don't follow through on regularly," he said. "I've learnt not to take it personally." She stepped further into the room, looking at the windows, at the city below. "How long have you been here, in this apartment?" 4 months. I owned it for longer. I just wasn't here." "Where were you?" "Elsewhere," he said. "Come, dinner is ready." The dinner table was set in the adjoining room, not the kitchen, which was beyond a door she could partially see, but a proper dining room, with another view of the city, and a table set for 2, with the kind of linen and crystal that suggested either a caterer or a housekeeper with strong opinions. He had cooked himself, as it turned out. She discovered this because he disappeared into the kitchen to bring out the first course, and she followed him, uninvited, because she was curious. He looked at her in the kitchen doorway with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "You can sit," he said. "I wanted to see." She looked at the kitchen, the pans, the organized workspace, the evidence of actual cooking rather than reheating. "You cooked?" "My father believed that a man who couldn't feed himself was not competent in any other domain either." A pause. "I don't know that I agree with all of his beliefs, but that one seemed reasonable." She helped carry things, which he accepted without comment, and they sat at the dining table, and the meal was She hadn't expected this either. Genuinely, quietly exceptional. Not the excess of a man trying to impress, but the restraint of someone who understood that the best food, like the best flowers, did not need to announce itself. They talked through 3 courses, not about his business, not about the funeral or his father, about Turin, the city's particular personality, its reserved northern pride, its history as the first capital of unified Italy, and the slight residual wound it seemed to carry about having been subsequently overlooked. About New York, which he described with the mixed feeling of someone who had lived there long enough to understand it, but had never made the mistake of thinking it understood him. About her grandmother's shop and the language of flowers, which he listened to with the focused attention he brought to everything. After dinner he poured wine, a Barolo, of course, local and old and certain of itself, and they moved to the cognac-coloured sofa, and the city glittered below the windows in the way that Turin did in winter, cold and bright and entirely beautiful. "Why did you invite me?" she asked. He turned his glass in his hands. "Because you were the only person who didn't look away at the cemetery." The simplicity of it settled between them. "I should have," she said. "Probably." He looked at her. "I'm glad you didn't." She should have gone home after dinner. The sensible version of herself, the grandmother-raised, notary-cousin consulting version, would have thanked him at the door, taken the elevator down to the beautiful lobby, walked across the Piazza Castello in the cold night air, and called a taxi to her apartment in Crocetta. She should have. She stayed until 11:30 and left only because she forced herself to, because she could feel the evening doing something to her sense of proportion, elongating it, the way certain wines did, making the distances between things feel manageable, when in the cold morning air they would resume their actual size. In the taxi home, she looked at her own hands in her lap and thought, "All right, this is happening. What happens now?" What happened next was complicated. He texted her Sunday morning. She had given him her number at some point during dinner. She no longer remembered the precise moment, which told her something about how smoothly it had occurred. A single line. "The freesia died. Advice?" She sent back, "More light. West-facing, if you have it." A pause. Then, "I'll move the window." She found herself smiling at her phone, which was not a thing she had done over a man's text message in some years. She put the phone down and made coffee, and the smile persisted. Over the following 2 weeks, she learned more. Not about the business. He was like a very well-engineered door on that subject, perfectly smooth, no handle. What she learned was everything around it, the texture of him. She learned that he slept badly, and had for years, that this was the reason he often texted at unusual hours, not intrusively, not demanding response, just present, in the way of someone who was awake and thinking and wanted her in the conversation. She learned that he read history obsessively, Roman history particularly, the period of the late Republic, which he found inexhaustibly relevant to the present. She learned that he had a particular dislike of dishonesty that was, she suspected, born of having practiced a great deal of it professionally. She also learned from Julia, who had a cousin whose boyfriend worked in a restaurant in San Salvario that certain people frequented, that Luca Ferrante was not simply a wealthy man with import interests. "The Ferrante family," Julia said carefully one morning, doing inventory in the back room while Valentina pretended not to be paying close attention. "They're real, Valentina. I mean, actually real." "I know they're real," Valentina said. Do you know what real means in this context? She did. She had known since the first envelope, but knowing and confronting were different things, and she had been allowing them to remain separate. Now, in the matter-of-fact inventory light of her back room, she let them meet. Luca Ferrante was the acting head of what had been his father's organization. After Antonio's death, natural, apparently, a heart that had simply decided one evening in October to stop, the succession had been orderly in the way that only very well-run organizations managed succession. Without visible chaos, without a power vacuum, without the public drama that would have attracted attention. Luca had been waiting to return. He had been, the stories suggested, in various American cities doing things that cemented alliances that his father had maintained at long distance for years. He was, to use the specific language of it, a don, not a theatrical one, not the movie version with its operatic fury and its visible menace. Something more modern and more dangerous. A man who moved through legitimate spaces with perfect ease and maintained his actual architecture entirely underground, visible only to those who needed to see it. Valentina sat with this. She had grown up in Turin. She was not ignorant of how certain things worked. Her grandmother had known a Fontana, not the famous Fontana family, a different branch, and had once said, with the matter-of-fact clarity she brought to all subjects, "There is the law, and then there is the way things actually work. And a sensible woman knows both and speaks of neither at dinner." She was a sensible woman. She had been raised to be one. She was also, she acknowledged, somewhere past the point where sensibility was fully operational. She went to the penthouse again the following Friday, and the Friday after that. And by the third Friday it had become a thing they both treated as established, unremarked upon, a fact of their weeks. She never saw anything specific. He was careful, extraordinarily careful, about keeping her entirely separate from whatever else his life contained. No men came and went during her visits. No calls were taken in her presence. When his phone rang, and it rang, occasionally, with the contained urgency of things requiring attention, he excused himself, went through a closed door, and returned in minutes, composed and present, and the conversation resumed without explanation. She did not ask. She had made, somewhere in the first weeks, a decision about which questions she would ask and which she would let remain closed, and she held to this with a discipline she recognized as somewhat borrowed from him. What she saw was this. A man in a beautiful apartment above a beautiful city, who cooked dinner and moved orchids toward better light and read history at midnight and texted her photographs of things he noticed, an old door with a particular iron handle, a cat on a palace windowsill, the exact color of the mountains in early morning when the snow caught the first light, and who looked at her with an attention that was, in her experience, entirely singular. On the fourth Friday, he kissed her. It happened at the door. She was leaving, as usual, coat on, bag over her shoulder, and he had walked her to the elevator, as usual, and they had been talking about something ordinary, and she had turned to say good night, and he was closer than she'd anticipated, and then he was closer still, and his hand was against her jaw with a care that was almost unbearable from a man who was so otherwise controlled, and the kiss was brief and deliberate, and everything she had not been allowing herself to fully expect. He pulled back, looked at her. "I should have asked," he said. "No," she said, "you shouldn't have." The city had its own opinion about them, as cities always do, Turin watched from its cafe windows and its palazzo courtyards, from the fog-softened streets of its medieval centre, from the long colonnaded arcades where people walked in the rain without getting wet, and where, therefore, conversations could be had that the open sky wouldn't hear. Valentina noticed the watching approximately 2 weeks after the first kiss, which had been followed by others, and by evenings that ended later, and by mornings where she woke in her own apartment thinking with a precision and vividness about a man she had no business thinking about this precisely and this vividly. She noticed the watching in small ways first. A car she didn't recognize parked across from the shop for 2 days running. A man she'd never seen before who came in to buy a single carnation, the least likely purchase for his type, which was the type of a man who existed in a certain professional category that had nothing to do with flowers, and who looked at her with an assessment that was entirely professional, in a way that had nothing to do with flowers either. She mentioned this to Luca on a Friday, casually, because she had decided that if they were going to do this, whatever this was, she would not pretend not to see things. He set down his wineglass. "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said. She told him. The car, the man with the carnation, the particular quality of attention she'd experienced. Luca was quiet for a moment that she recognized as the kind of quiet that contained active thinking rather than absence of thought. "Are you frightened?" he asked, and she recognized the question. It was the same one he'd asked in the shop weeks ago. "Curious," she said, "and perhaps slightly annoyed. That's my professional space." Something moved through his expression, that almost smile that was becoming slightly more frequent in her presence, she'd noticed. "Good," he said. "I'd rather you were annoyed than frightened." A pause. "The man with the carnation is not a concern you need to carry, but I want you to tell me if you see him again." "And the car?" "Also not your concern." A pause. "But tell me." "Luca," she met his eyes. "I am an adult woman with a reasonably functional grasp of what I've involved myself with. You don't have to manage the information I receive. You can simply tell me what's happening." He looked at her steadily for a long moment. "What's happening," he said, "is that my father's death created a period of renegotiation with several parties who believe that grief creates opportunity. Some of them are testing the perimeter of things that matter to me to see if I notice. I notice. I have already responded." "Things that matter to you," she repeated, "including this shop?" "Including you." The word landed with the weight of something that had been decided long before tonight. "I see," she said. "I would have told you sooner," he said, "but I was also testing whether you'd tell me without being asked." "You passed." She blinked. "You were testing me?" "No," he shook his head, and there was something in his expression that was the closest she'd seen to an apology. "I was trying to understand you. There's a difference, though I grant you the distinction may be technical." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're used to operating in a world where everyone has a secondary motive." "Yes." "And you needed to know if I did." "Yes." "And now you know I don't." "I knew at the cemetery," he said. "I've been confirming." She should have been angry. She examined the emotion carefully and found that what was actually there was more complicated. A recognition, under the surface irritation, that he had operated exactly as he would need to operate to have survived in the life he was living. That his caution was not insult, but architecture. That understanding what kept a person standing was different from endorsing every brick. "All right," she said. He looked at her carefully. "All right. I understand why you did it. I don't love it, but I understand it." She picked up her wineglass. "Don't do it again." He held her gaze. "No," he said. "I won't." And she believed him, which was either very sensible or very foolish, and in this moment she couldn't fully determine which. What she could determine was the way he looked at her for the rest of that evening, with something that had shifted slightly, a degree or two in the direction of something less controlled, like a door that has been sealed a long time and has finally, in response to a single specific pressure, begun to move. She drove home at midnight thinking about gravity, about how it was not a decision, about how objects did not choose to move toward each other, they simply did as a function of mass and proximity and the irreducible physics of the universe. She thought, "I am in significant trouble." Then she thought, "Yes, and I'm going anyway." Matteo Ferrante arrived on a Tuesday. Valentina was in the middle of a bridal consultation. The bride, a very organized woman named Chiara, who was marrying an equally organized man named Stefano, had strong opinions about peonies and ranunculus when the bell above the door chimed at 2:15, and she looked up and felt the air in the shop change. He was younger than Luca by perhaps 5 years, and similar in some visible ways, the height, the dark colouring, the quality of the coat. But the similarities served mostly to illuminate the differences. Where Luca was still, Matteo was kinetic, a particular kind of energy that announced itself in the way he moved, the way his eyes moved, quick and assessing in a manner that felt less like intelligence and more like the inability to hold still. He was handsome in a way that knew itself and used it. The smile he deployed at Valentina as he came into the shop was designed. She could see the design in it, the way she could see the design in an arrangement that was trying too hard. "I'll only be a moment," he said to her, to Chiara, to the room. The kind of person who operated on the assumption that his presence was welcome. "We're in the middle of a consultation," Valentina said pleasantly. "Of course." He sat down in the chair by the door, the chair she kept there for waiting customers, with the ease of someone who had never in their life been made to feel unwelcome anywhere. "I'll wait." He waited. He did not look at his phone, which impressed her despite herself. He looked at the shop with a quality that reminded her faintly of Luca, and then, on second examination, didn't. Because what Luca had was attention, and what Matteo had was appraisal, and those were different things. She finished the consultation, confirmed the order with Chiara, saw her out, and turned to Matteo. "You know who I am," he said. "You look like your brother," she said. He grinned. It was, she conceded internally, a genuinely compelling grin. "People always say that. Luca hates it." He stood, extended his hand. "Matteo Ferrante, you're Valentina." "Valentina Greco." She shook his hand. "What can I do for you?" "Luca doesn't know I'm here," he said, which confirmed something she'd already suspected. "I wanted to meet you." "To assess me?" "No," he tilted his head, "to understand what's happening, which is different." She noted the echo, the same distinction Luca had drawn about testing versus understanding. Brothers, clearly. "What do you want to know?" she said. "Are you in love with him?" It was a direct question, the kind that certain people used as weapons and certain others used as the most efficient path to what they needed. She wasn't sure which this was. "That's not something I'm going to answer for you," she said. "Fair," he nodded, apparently unsurprised. "Do you know what his life is? In general terms?" "In general terms is insufficient for what his life actually is," Matteo said, and now something changed in his voice. The lightness dropped a register, and she heard something real under it, something that sounded startlingly like concern. Not for her, for Luca. "He is not a man who does things halfway. When he decides something matters, it matters in a way that has consequences." "You're warning me," she said. "I'm informing you." He looked at her steadily. He's been alone for a very long time. He chose to be. He believed that keeping people at a distance was practical. That's his word. Practical. After what happened in New York. He stopped. "What happened in New York?" He shook his head. "That's his to tell you, or not. I'm just saying, he's not easy. He's not built for easy. And when he lets someone in, it's—" He paused, choosing words with more care now. "It becomes a fortress, Valentina. He doesn't let people in halfway. If you're in, you're in. And if you're going to leave, I'd rather you left now than in 2 years when it would be—" "A fortress," she said softly. He nodded. Yes. She thought about this, about the quality of his attention she had noticed from the first day in the shop, about the texts at midnight and the moved orchid and the hand against her jaw at the elevator door. "I understand what you're telling me," she said. "Good." He stood, picked up his coat from the back of the chair. "He'll probably be furious that I came." "Will you tell him?" "Absolutely not." The grin returned, and this time it felt slightly more genuine, as if the mask had settled into something more comfortable. "Pleasure to meet you, Valentina. The shop is beautiful." He left, and she stood in the quiet aftermath of him and thought about fortresses, and about people who chose solitude as a practical measure, and about what it meant when a man like that stopped choosing it. She thought about Luca, about the cemetery, about a son kneeling at his father's grave, weeping in a silence so deep it could only come from years of practice. She thought, "I'm already in." He told her about New York on a night in December when the Alps were white down to the lower slopes, and Turin's colonnaded streets had taken on the particular winter beauty of a city that had been beautiful for several centuries and knew how to wear it. They were in the penthouse. They often were on evenings. She had slowly stopped counting the Fridays and started simply coming when she wanted to and when he asked, which was becoming the same thing. She had never brought overnight things. This felt important to maintain, a small private declaration of territory, and he had not pushed. He was, she had come to understand, extremely good at not pushing, at creating space and waiting, with a patience that was its own kind of gravity. She asked him directly, because Matteo had said it was his to tell, and she had been patient, but she was not infinitely so. What happened in New York? He was at the window, she was on the sofa. Outside, the first real snow of winter was beginning, not settling yet, just a suggestion, flakes that appeared in the window light and vanished before they reached the glass. He didn't answer immediately. She waited. "Her name was Elena," he said. "We were together for 2 years. I was in New York, managing the American Alliance, 2 families, one in Chicago, one in Miami, and a network of intermediaries that required someone trusted to hold the center. It was work that was consuming, the kind of work that leaves very little of you over. He stopped. She waited. Elena was Italian, from Naples, which should have been a warning. A slight, humourless inflection at this, self-aware rather than cruel. Neapolitan families have their own configurations, their own loyalties. I knew this. I chose not to fully account for it because I was... He stopped again. Because I wanted her to be uncomplicated. She wasn't. No. She was with the Esposito family in Naples. Not in it, but connected. She had cousins. You understand what cousins means in this context. Yes. She was with me as a long placement. He said the words flatly, without drama. 18 months before I understood it fully. Long enough for us to have had... He stopped. Long enough for it to matter. Valentina sat very still. There was a meeting in Chicago that she passed the details of to people who used them to complicate the meeting significantly. A pause. 2 men I had known for 12 years didn't come home from that complication. The snow was falling properly now. She could see it accumulating on the railing of the terrace, the quiet accumulation of it. "I'm sorry," she said. I handled it. The flatness again. Elena went back to Naples. I stayed in New York for another year, and then came home when when it became apparent he wasn't well. A long pause. I decided in New York that proximity was a tactical error, that personal entanglements created surfaces through which damage entered. "And now?" she asked quietly. He turned from the window, looked at her across the room. The distance between the window and the sofa, 10 or 12 feet, but the way he crossed it slowly felt like something different than distance. He sat in the chair across from her, not on the sofa, not close. The chair. "Now I'm telling you this," he said, "because I don't want to operate on incomplete information between us, and because..." He stopped. Tried again. "Because you are not Elena, and I have known that since the cemetery, and I would rather you knew why I have been..." "Careful," she offered. "Armoured," he said. A better word. He looked at her. "I am also telling you this because the people who sent a man to buy a carnation at your shop need to understand, clearly, that you are not a surface through which damage enters. You are..." He paused. "You are something I will protect." The word landed with the weight of something that had been decided long before tonight. "Then protect me," she said. "But don't hide me. Don't decide for me what I can handle." He looked up at her. Something in his face was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before, except at the cemetery. "No," he said, "I won't." She put her hand against his jaw, the way he had put his against hers at the elevator weeks ago, and felt the muscle there, the slight tension, the breath he took that was barely perceptible. "Good," she said. The snow fell. He took her to the nightclub in January. It was not the kind of invitation she'd expected. She'd imagined dinners, perhaps a drive into the hills, the contained and careful world of the penthouse. She had not imagined a nightclub, which suggested either spontaneity or a change of strategy, and with Luca she was increasingly certain that nothing was entirely unstrategic. The club was in Vanquilla, the neighbourhood that had been reinventing itself for a decade in the way of certain Turin districts, the old industrial bones draped in new cultural ambitions. It was called Ossidiana, which meant obsidian, and the name was accurate. It was black and hard-edged and reflected light beautifully. From the outside it was unremarkable, a door, two men, a discreet sign. Inside it was the kind of place that knew exactly what it was doing. They arrived at 11, which was still early by Ossidiana's standards. The music was electronic, atmospheric, the kind that was felt as much as heard, and the light was the deep amber of amber in its natural state. Not warm exactly, more like heat preserved in stone. People saw him. She noticed this, the way a room reorganizes itself around a specific presence, subtle adjustments of posture and direction, the small, involuntary recalibrations of people who have registered something important without quite acknowledging it. Two men across the room met his eyes and gave the almost imperceptible nod of people acknowledging authority without making a scene of it. He kept his hand at the small of her back. This was new, physical, in a way he'd been deliberate about, and she was aware of it with a precision that she hoped didn't show on her face. He knew people. Of course he did. This was his city, and this was the specific geography of his city. He introduced her simply Valentina. No qualifier, no context, and the people he introduced her to received this with the particular attentiveness of people who understand that information given simply by this specific man carries specific weight. There was a table reserved on the upper level which overlooked the floor. He ordered things she hadn't asked for, and they were exactly right, which she had come to expect. He watched the room below with a comfortable authority that wasn't possessive or aggressive, just present, the way a very good sailor watches the sea, not afraid of it, but not incautious about it either. "Do you enjoy this?" she asked, meaning the club, the world, the particular social geometry they were occupying. "No," he said, without hesitation or apology, "but it is necessary to be seen occasionally, and I prefer to choose the terms." "So I'm part of the terms?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "you are now. Visible. I decided to make that a statement rather than a vulnerability." She understood the translation. By bringing her here, to this room, in this explicit way, he was making clear to whoever was watching that she was under his protection, that the watching, the carnation man, the parked car, was understood and answered. It was a declaration written in social code, in the precise language of this world. It was also, she thought, the most public thing he had done with her, and therefore, in some way, the most honest. "All right," she said. "You're not angry." "I'm not naive," she said. "You're protecting me, I understand that. I prefer when you tell me you're doing it and why, as opposed to when you manage the information." She picked up her drink. "You told me. I appreciate it." He looked at her for a moment with that focused attention. "You are the most straightforward person I have encountered in 15 years, he said. "That can't be true." "In my world," he said, "it is absolutely true." The music shifted. She felt it change in her sternum, the bass frequencies registering in bone. Across the room, a man appeared at the top of the stairs, not old, perhaps 35, well dressed in a way that didn't quite achieve its goal, the clothes correct, but the wearing of them slightly off. He scanned the room and found their table, and his gaze held for a beat too long. Luca had noticed before she finished noticing. "Stay here," he said. "What? I'll be 4 minutes." His hand touched her shoulder briefly. "Please." He crossed the room. She watched him cross it, the way he moved through the crowd, parted and reformed around him, without anyone being visibly asked to part, the way the suited man's expression changed when Luca reached him, the brief conversation she couldn't hear over the music, the conclusive quality of it. The suited man left the club. Luca came back in 4 minutes, as promised. "Who was that?" she asked. "Someone testing my attention," he said, "who has now been corrected." He looked at her, and she recognized the look. It was the look from the window of the penthouse, unguarded in a specific way. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I told you. I'm annoyed, not frightened." And again that almost smile, warmer this time, fractionally more certain of itself. They stayed until 2 in the morning, and he drove her home himself. She hadn't known he drove, had assumed drivers, but he drove a dark car with the same controlled capability he brought to everything. And at her door, he kissed her in the cold night air with the snow-salt smell of Turin around them, and it was different from the previous kisses in the way that things deepen rather than simply progress. She went upstairs and stood at her kitchen window, looking at the street below where his car had been, and thought that certain gravity could not be escaped, and perhaps should not be. February arrived, and brought with it a particular quality of trouble. His name, she learned, was Sergio Caruso. He was connected to a family in Milan, not the old Milanese families, but the newer money, the kind that had arrived in the past 15 years from the south and east, and had established itself in the vacuum created by several significant arrests in 2019 and 2020 that had reorganized the northern Italian landscape. Caruso wanted Turin. This was the simplest version of a complicated thing. The Ferrante family's position in the city was the obstacle, and Valentina Greco, the florist of Crocetta, had become, through a combination of her own genuine significance to Luca and Caruso's calculation about where calculation might be profitable, a card in this game she hadn't chosen. She learned this not from Luca directly, but from Matteo, who arrived at her shop on a Wednesday with 2 men she didn't recognize, and said, with the directness she was beginning to understand was the Ferrante family's primary communicative mode, "You need to know what's happening." She closed the shop early. She sat in the back room with Matteo across the work table, while his 2 men positioned themselves with the casual precision of people accustomed to positioning themselves. "Caruso's people have been watching you for 3 weeks, Matteo said. "Not dangerously, not yet. Establishing patterns, your hours, your routes, who comes in and out. And Luca knows this. Luca knows this, and is handling it in his way, which involves several things I'm not going to detail, and which will be effective. But I wanted you to know because—" He stopped, looked at the table between them. "Because I think you deserve to make fully informed decisions." "About whether to stay," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about Chiara, the organized bride with her strong opinions about peonies who would be married in April. About Julia, who was 22 and taking on more responsibility. About her grandmother's copper watering can on the shelf behind her, worn smooth at the handle from decades of use. About the shop and the language of flowers and the life she had built here. She thought about a man weeping silently at a grave in November fog. "I'm not leaving," she said. Matteo looked at her steadily. "You understand what that means." "It means I'm in," she said. "It means your metaphor, Matteo. The fortress. I'm in. I'm choosing to be in with full information. He nodded. Something in his face that was younger than the rest of him, something that reminded her that he was perhaps 29, 28, that he was also a man who had not had the ordinary options, shifted towards something she thought might be relief. "He doesn't know I'm here," he said. Again. Again. He almost smiled. "I'll tell him this time. He should know. He should know I already knew and chose to stay." Matteo looked at her for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, "He's never done this before. Not since Elena. And that was different. That was him trying to be normal and failing because normal wasn't what he was operating with. This is—" He shook his head. "He checks the security feeds for your block at 2 in the morning, Valentina. I'm not supposed to know this, but I do. He is not—" A pause. "He is not moderate about anything, and he is not moderate about you." She sat with this information. The security feeds, the 2 in the morning, the man who texted at midnight photographs of cats on windowsills. "I know," she said. "Good," said Matteo. "Then we understand each other." When she called Luca that evening, he picked up on the first ring. Another thing she'd noted, he always answered on the first ring, which was either the reflex of a man accustomed to urgency or a specific choice he'd made about her, and she suspected both. "Matteo came to the shop," she said. A silence. "I see. He told me about Caruso. He told me what's happening. I want you to know that I know, and that I'm not going anywhere." A longer silence. She could hear him breathe, something she'd never consciously registered before, but right now it was the most specific sound in the room. "Valentina," he said, and the way he said her name in that moment was something she had no adequate language for. It was not soft exactly. It was precise in a different way than his usual precision. Precise with the weight of something that had been held under enormous pressure for a long time. "I know," she said again, softer. "He shouldn't have. He was right to," she said. "Please don't be angry with him. He loves you. He did it for you." Another silence, shorter. "Are you frightened?" he asked. Third time. "No," she said. "I'm yours." Those are different things. The pause that followed was long enough that she thought briefly the call had dropped. Then, very quiet, almost not a voice at all. "Yes, you are." In March, he took her south. Not far south, only to the Monferrato Hills, 2 hours by road, where the Ferrante family had maintained a property since the 1960s. It was not a summer house, he explained as they drove, the Alfa moving through the vineyard country with the ease of a car entirely comfortable with its own capabilities, the hills around them going soft and early green with the first suggestions of spring. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "She was the one who established it. My grandfather bought the land in 58, but she was the one who made it—" He searched for the word. "Habitable." "In what sense?" "In the sense that a building does not become a home without someone deciding it will be one. My grandfather built things. My grandmother lived in them. The distinction mattered." "And your father?" "My father lived in it the way he lived in everything. Strategically. It was useful for certain meetings, private, defensible, far from urban surveillance." A pause. "He did also, I believe, love it. He just couldn't say so without feeling it contradicted something." What did it contradict? His understanding of himself as a practical man. The dry inflection she'd come to recognize as his version of affection for the dead. He believed that love of places was a weakness. I think he was wrong. I think places hold things that we can't hold by ourselves. Like cemeteries, she said. Like cemeteries. The property appeared around a curve in the road without announcement. It was not what she had expected. She had been imagining something architectural, the word mansion conjuring columns and display. What she found was a stone farmhouse enlarged over decades into something substantial but never ostentatious, surrounded by old-growth olive trees and vines that were not yet fully awake from winter, and a view of the hills that was simply, unpretentiously magnificent. They stayed 3 days. She had not planned 3 days. She had packed for a weekend, which was in itself a kind of crossing that she'd made with full awareness. But the house had a quality that resisted departure. Its thick stone walls, and its deep-silled windows, and its smell of old wood, and the particular dry sweetness of wine country in early spring. It held the kind of silence she loved best, the silence of a place that had absorbed a great deal of time. He showed her everything. The wine cellar, genuinely old, with bottles going back to the 1940s, some of them almost certainly undrinkable now, kept for the archaeology of it. The library, which contained his grandmother's books alongside his own, history and biography, and a surprising number of novels, in Italian and English and some French. The kitchen, which was large and light, and where he cooked again, both evenings. On the second evening, after dinner, they sat on the terrace in the mild March night, with the hills dark around them and the sky, away from the city, extravagant with stars. "You grew up here partly," she said. "Summers, after my mother left." He stopped. Started again. "After my mother went back to her family in Palermo, my father sent Matteo and me here in the summers, with my grandmother." A pause. "It was the sanest part of my childhood." "She was like you," Valentina said. "Your grandmother. The control." "She was nothing like me," he said, but the warmth in his voice made it a compliment to her. "She was fearless, not controlled, genuinely unafraid. She had seen things that should have destroyed her, and they hadn't, and she knew, after that very little was actually as dangerous as it appeared." "What things?" "The war, and after the war, the things my grandfather was involved in during the Reconstruction years, the kind of involvement that kept food on certain tables and solved certain problems and created others." He looked at the sky. She called it il mestiere, the trade, never glamorized it, never pretended it was other than what it was, but she also never apologized for it. "Are you like her in that?" Valentina asked. "Do you apologize for it?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't apologize for it. I did not choose to be born into this. I did choose to stay in it when I was old enough to choose. That choice I own without apology." A pause. "Though I think about it regularly." "And what do you think?" He turned to look at her fully in the starlight. "I think that I am capable of doing right by the things I am responsible for. And I think—" He stopped. "I think that I want a life with more than responsibility in it." The hill's silence answered. The vines were dark and patient around them. She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that until the night got cold enough to go inside. And when they went inside, they did not go to separate rooms. and the house absorbed this the way it absorbed everything, quietly, without demanding it be named, holding it in its thick walls, the way places hold the things that happen in them. She found out the truth about her father on a Thursday in April. It arrived the way the worst truths arrive, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a small, specific moment. She was in the penthouse, early, waiting for Luca, who was running late from a meeting. She was reading on the sofa, a glass of water on the table, entirely comfortable in the space that had become, over months, as familiar to her as her own apartment. His phone rang. He'd left it on the kitchen counter by accident. She could see it from the sofa, screen up, the name on the screen not a name, but an initial. V. She didn't answer it. Of course she didn't. It rang out and then buzzed with a message, and she did not look at the message. But the initial lodged in her mind, and she had always been, a woman who noticed things. When Luca came in 20 minutes later and picked up the phone and read the message, and the smallest possible compression crossed his brow before he smoothed it, she noticed that, too. "Who is V?" she asked. Quietly, not combatively. He looked up from the phone, held her gaze. "Vincenzo Morelli," he said. "He's a man who worked for my father for many years. He's now working for me. He's calling you on a Thursday night. He does that sometimes, when there are matters that—" He stopped, looked at her more carefully. "What is it?" She had learned to trust the thing in her chest that operated faster than her cognitive processing. It was doing something right now, not alarm exactly, but the specific sensation of proximity to information that would change something. The feeling she got when she cut into a stem that was more damaged than it appeared. "Valentina," he said. "My father's name was Aldo Greco," she said. "He died when I was 14. Heart attack, my mother always said. I grew up in Crocetta. My grandmother had the shop. It was very ordinary." She paused. "His name was Aldo Greco, and when I was 12, there was a period when men came to our apartment in the evenings. Not every week, but sometimes, and my mother always sent me to my room, and in the morning everything was normal again." She looked at him. "I've always wondered about those evenings." Luca was very still. "My father worked for someone," she said. It was not a question. "Valentina, did he work for your father?" The silence that followed was of the kind that contained its own answer. She stood up, walked to the window. The city below was doing its April evening, the arcades lit, the Mole Antonelliana lit at the tip, the Alps still holding snow on the high peaks. "Tell me," she said. He told her. Not everything, she understood there were limits, would always be limits, but enough. Aldo Greco had been, for 8 years in the late 1990s and early 2000s, an intermediary for the Ferrante family. Not a violent role. Her father had been good at moving things, at knowing people, at the particular social engineering that kept networks functioning. He had been, by Antonio Ferrante's own account, a valued man. He had also been a man with a bad heart, who had died at 44 of exactly what his wife had said. "They paid for your grandmother's shop lease," Luca said. "When your grandmother inherited the lease, the property company that held it was affiliated." He paused. "I only learned this recently, going through my father's records after the death." She stood at the window for a long time. The city was beautiful and entirely indifferent. "So I have been part of this longer than I knew. Your father was part of it. You were a child. You have been exactly what you appear to be, a florist in Turin. A pause. The shop is yours. It has been yours legally for years. I want to be clear about that. But the original is old history, yes. He came to the window, stood beside her, not touching. I can understand if this changes. Stop, she said. He stopped. She stood at the window for another minute, feeling the various things that were moving through her, the grief for a father she had known imperfectly, the strange vertigo of a life that turned out to be differently shaped than she'd believed, the specific, complicated feeling of learning that the world you'd thought you lived in was larger and more entangled than the version you'd been shown. And underneath all of that, very steady, the knowledge that the man beside her had told her the truth when he could have said nothing. You didn't have to tell me, she said. No, he said. I didn't. Why did you? He was quiet for a moment, then, because I told you I wouldn't manage information between us. And because... He stopped. Because you deserve to know where you come from, even the parts that are complicated. She turned from the window, looked at him. Thank you, she said. He looked back at her, and she saw it clearly, not the controlled man, not the measured strategist. She saw what Matteo had described, the man who was not moderate about anything, and she saw what that not moderation looked like when it was turned toward her. Something immense and careful, and deeply, specifically, hers. I love you, she said. First time, simply. He stood very still for a moment. Then he reached out and put his hand against her face with that careful precision. I know, he said. I have been trying to find an adequate way to say the same thing for approximately 4 months. Say it, she said. Ti amo, he said, completely, without reservation, in a way that I don't have any prior experience of and am not entirely competent to manage. She almost laughed. She smiled instead and felt it reach all the way through her. Good, she said. I'll help you manage it. The situation with Caruso came to its head in late April. She wasn't present for the mechanics of it. She had understood by now the nature of the arrangement she was living in. There were rooms she was in and rooms she was not, and the rooms she was not were not a secret, but a boundary. And the boundary was not condescension, but protection. And she had made her peace with this, with something approaching genuine peace, rather than resigned performance of it. What she knew. Caruso had made a move. Something financial, something territorial, something that had required Luca to be unavailable for 48 hours in a way that he was never unavailable, and that Matteo, when he'd called her to explain that Luca would be out of contact, had described with a tightness in his voice that told her more than the words did. She worked the 2 days. Chiara the bride's final floral consultation. Peonies confirmed, ranunculus confirmed, a bower arrangement that Valentina was genuinely proud of. A May Day arrangement for a city hotel. 3 sympathy orders that arrived in the particular cluster that grief seemed to travel in. She worked, and she did not panic, and she did not call or text, because Matteo had said out of contact, and she understood what that meant. On the 3rd day, Luca appeared at the shop at 8 in the morning. She was alone. Julia didn't arrive until 9:30, and she was at the back room door with a bucket of cut flowers when he walked in. and she knew from a single look that whatever had happened was over, and he was whole physically. And then she crossed to him and put her arms around him without thinking about it, the way the body goes toward what it needs without asking permission. He held her, both arms tight, in a way he hadn't before. A containment rather than an embrace, the way you hold something when you've been scared of losing it and haven't been able to say so. "Are you hurt?" she asked against his shoulder. "No." "Is it over?" "Yes." She didn't ask more than that. She held him, and he held her, and the shop was quiet around them, the flowers doing their patient witnessing thing, and outside Turin was starting its day without regard for what had just concluded. "Come to the back room," she said eventually. "I'll make coffee." He sat on the stool she kept for herself, while she made espresso on the machine she'd bought second-hand and maintained with religious devotion. And he looked around the back room, at the flowers in their buckets, at the copper watering can, at the walls with their old floral charts and the ribbons in their organised rows, with the expression she'd seen at the cemetery the first day. "My father wanted to bring me here once," he said. "I was 17. He was establishing the relationship with the Greco family, with your father. He wanted to show me where he got the flowers for my mother's birthday. I refused to come because I was 17 and considered it beneath me." A pause. "I have thought about this several times in the past months." She brought him the espresso, sat on the other stool. "Do you think he knew that we'd—" "I think he would have been extremely pleased with himself if he did," Luca said, and the dry warmth in his voice was the warmest she'd ever heard him. He was insufferably pleased with himself about most things he managed correctly. She smiled. He was impossible," Luca said. "Completely impossible for 30 of the 37 years I knew him. And in the last 7, when he was dying by degrees and knew it, he became—" He stopped. "Human. Or more visibly human. He was human all along. He simply decided at the end to show it." "That's where you come from," she said quietly. He looked at her. "The showing," she said. "It's hard for you too, but you do it. You chose to." He held her gaze for a moment, then, unexpected, "He would have liked you enormously. He always said he wanted me to find someone who wasn't afraid of him. He meant afraid of what I am. He was trying, in his way, he was trying to say that you deserved something real," she said. "Yes." She reached across and put her hand over his on the work table, the worn wooden surface, the familiar smell of green things and water. "You have it," she said. He turned his hand and held hers, and outside the shop the spring morning continued its work, and in the quiet back room of Fiori di Sera something settled, not dramatically, not with the thunder of a climax, but with the deep, irreversible quality of a foundation completed. The thing about Julia was that she had known for months. This became apparent on a Tuesday in May when she arrived at work, hung up her coat, picked up the arrangement she was building for a retirement party, and said, without preamble, "He came in this morning while you were at the market." Valentina looked up from the delivery ledger. "Luca came in. Left these." Julia set a small wrapped package on the counter with the neutrality of someone exercising enormous professional restraint. "And he stayed for about 15 minutes, which he spent rearranging the window display." "He—" Valentina blinked. "Why?" He said the lavender was blocking the light to the anemones. A pause. He was right, actually. I rearranged it back to something more correct, and it is better. Valentina stared at the package. He rearranged the window display. He has opinions about flower placement, Julia said, back to the retirement arrangement. He also asked about the Tuesday delivery and whether the Tuesday supplier was reliable or whether we should consider an alternative because he knows someone in Asti. She paused again. He is very involved. Valentina picked up the package. Inside was a small folded note, the angular handwriting, and something wrapped in tissue. A miniature cutting from an olive tree, roots wrapped in damp cloth, with a note that read, "For the shop, permanent, not for a funeral. L." She stood holding the olive cutting and felt something in her chest that was too large to be categorized. "Julia," she said. "Yes. How long have you known?" Julia turned to look at her with the expression of someone deciding how honest to be. "The second time he came in," she said, "after the funeral delivery. I wasn't here, but I saw the envelope he'd left, and I looked you up, and then I looked him up, because I have functional internet access and a naturally inquiring mind." A pause. I decided it was not my place to say anything. "But you're saying something now." "I'm saying something now because he rearranged the window display," Julia said, with complete seriousness. "And because he asked me whether you were happy. Not whether you were well or whether the shop was doing well. Whether you were happy." She turned back to her arrangement. "I thought you should know," he asked. Valentina stood very still. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him yes," Julia said. "And I told him that was mostly his doing, which he received with," she considered, "with extreme dignity. For a man who was just told something very nice by a 22-year-old over a bucket of ranunculus." Valentina put the olive cutting on the counter next to the register where it would get the morning light through the east window. She looked at it for a moment, the small roots, the resilient green. "He's going to propose," Julia said, in the tone of someone confirming a weather forecast. Valentina looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "Because he asked me whether you have a preferred flower, specifically, personally. Not for a client, not for an arrangement. What is your flower?" She met Valentina's eyes. "I told him. I hope that was all right." "What did you tell him?" "Freesia," Julia said. "White freesia. The first thing he ever bought from the shop." Valentina looked at the olive cutting and the morning light moving through the window and the busy, beloved interior of her grandmother's shop, and she breathed in the green, living smell of it. "Yes," she said, to no one in particular. "Yes, what?" Julia asked. "Nothing." A smile. "Get back to the arrangement. The retirement party is at 6. Julia went back to the arrangement with the air of someone who had said what they needed to say and was now entirely satisfied. Valentina carried the olive cutting to the east window and set it carefully in the light, and thought about a man who rearranged flower displays and asked 22-year-olds whether his girlfriend was happy. She thought about the cemetery in November and a stranger's grief and an olive branch for peace. She thought, "I am going to say yes." May in Turin was the best month. She had always believed this, had argued for it against the partisans of September and April, with the conviction of someone who had spent 28 May mornings in the city and knew its particular quality. The way the chestnut trees along the colonnades went extravagantly pink and white. The way the light finally committed to warmth rather than merely suggesting it. The way the city opened up and people walked slower and the evenings lasted long enough to be properly used. She was in the hills again, the Monferrato property, which she had come to think of as partly hers in the way of places that hold important things, on a Saturday evening in mid-May when Luca asked her. There was no dinner-table formality. They had been working in the garden. She had taken an interest in the property's neglected kitchen garden and had been improving it on visits, with his ambivalent participation. Ambivalent because he was not naturally a gardener, but had proved willing to be instructed. They were dirty-handed and slightly sun-warm, and the evening was the golden May kind, and he stopped in the middle of a row of tomato plants and looked at her. She knew from the quality of the looking. He reached into his jacket pocket. He'd come outside in his jacket, and she'd thought nothing of it, and brought out a ring that was old, unmistakably old, the gold warm and worn, in the way of things that have been worn by hands for decades. "My grandmother's," he said. "She told my father to give it to whoever I was going to spend my life with. He kept it for 15 years, waiting for that person." A pause. "He would have liked knowing I'm giving it to the daughter of someone he respected." She looked at the ring, at him, at the tomato plants around them, the evening hills, the place that held the things they had been building. "You should probably say the words," she said. "Valentina Greco." He said her full name with the same precision he brought to everything, but underneath it, the thing she had first heard at the cemetery, the weight that was not aggression, but depth. "I am not an easy man. I have not led an easy life, and I am not capable of offering you a simple one. I am capable of offering you complete honesty, as much safety as it is in my power to create, and the kind of love that I cannot moderate or control, and have stopped trying to. You have seen me at my worst moment and stayed. You have made the back room of your grandmother's shop the most important place I've been in 15 years. I want you in every room. I want you in the complicated ones, and the quiet ones, and the ones that are only ours." He stopped. "Will you marry me?" It was not a question, exactly. It was a statement offered as a question, the way all the most important things in their particular language were, stated with the precision of complete certainty, but given to her as a choice. "Yes," she said. The same word from that morning in the shop, but fuller now, with all the months behind it, all the flowers and the silence and the cemetery and the hills and the midnight texts and the moved orchid and the second cousin who had told the truth about a window display. He put the ring on her finger. His hands were the hands she had first noticed in the shop in November, strong, precise, a little broken by living and healed without ceremony. They held hers with the same care he had always held the things that mattered. She kissed him in the kitchen garden, with the hills going golden around them and the city out of sight, just the hills and the vines and the old stone house and the evening. Above them, the Alps were still white. The vines were beginning to leaf in their first green, thin and translucent against the sky, and the light was doing what May light does in those hills, staying too long, refusing to depart, as if the evening itself had decided this moment was worth extending. She thought about November, about a foggy Tuesday morning and an envelope of cash, and a stranger's grief displayed in the private language of a cemetery. about how a single order of flowers, chosen with the specific, accumulated vocabulary of a woman who had spent her entire life in this language, had been the first sentence of the longest and truest conversation of her life. She thought about the olive branch, for peace, even for lives that didn't know much of it. She thought, here is what the olive branch was for. They married in November. She had not originally intended November. She was a florist. She understood about spring flowers and their conventional supremacy. She knew what a May wedding meant in Piemonte in terms of colour and abundance, and the easy, unearned beauty of that season. But November was when it had started, and she felt strongly, in a way she couldn't entirely articulate but could argue for, that the circle of a year was the right container for a beginning that needed to acknowledge its own particular origin. The ceremony was small. This was her preference, and he made no argument. He was, in general, not interested in display for its own sake, and a wedding that was primarily attended by the people one actually loved seemed to him simply correct. The people they actually loved. Matteo, who was the best man, and who gave a speech that was both funnier and more sincere than anyone had predicted. He spoke for 7 minutes, which was exactly right, and he said things that made the small room laugh at the first half and go very quiet at the second. At the end, looking at his brother, he said, I have waited 33 years for you to make one fully uncalculated decision. Thank you for making it. Then he looked at Valentina and said, he checks the security feeds for your block at 2 in the morning. I've known about this for a year. I think honestly, it's embarrassing. But it is also the most Luca thing I have ever known him to do, and I love him for it. He raised his glass. To the florist, who didn't look away. Julia, who cried during this speech, which surprised everyone, including herself. She was the maid of honour, and she wore a dress the colour of sage, and she arranged Valentina's bouquet herself. White freesia, of course, with dark olive branches and a single stem of deepest red rose, and she presented it at the door of the church with the gravity of someone handing over something they had built with care and were proud of. Valentina's mother, who had come from Palermo, where she had retired to a small house full of sunlight and family and the ordinary consolations of a life well finished, her mother had, spent the morning looking at Luca with the combination of approval and assessment that Italian mothers deploy as a single unified instrument that cuts and measures simultaneously. Who had said to Valentina before the ceremony, quietly, in the room set aside for the bride, your father would have... and stopped. And started again. I'm glad you know. I'm glad you both know. It makes it less of a secret and more of a history. Those are different things. She touched her daughter's face. He would have been pleased. He was always pleased when things came around right. 2 of Luca's oldest friends, men whose histories were complicated and who wore them with the same absence of apology that she had come to understand as the particular quality of people who had made their choices fully, without the comfortable fiction of having been only circumstantially involved. Their wives were warm and funny and immediately treated Valentina as someone who had always been in the category she was now formally entering, which was a grace she noticed and was grateful for. The church was San Lorenzo, small and old, one of the oldest in Turin, its walls containing the accretion of 5 centuries of prayer and marriage and grief, and the ordinary, extraordinary persistence of human life. It was full of flowers. She had arranged them herself, which was not unexpected, but which took 3 days of complete creative immersion, and which Julia had assisted with the focused competence of someone who understood that certain work required a particular quality of attention and had the discipline to provide it. The flowers were the distillation of everything she knew about the language, not a demonstration, not a display, but a statement. White lilies at the altar for strength, evergreen, dark and permanent, woven throughout the pew ends. Olive branches, many of them, generous, the silver green of them running along every surface, for peace. And freesia, white freesia, from the altar to the entrance, filling the old church with a scent that was clean and specific and entirely and specifically hers. He saw her come through the door. He was standing at the altar with Matteo beside him and the priest and the small assembled world of the people they loved, and he saw her come through the door in the November morning light, through the fragrance she had built, and his face did the thing it did very rarely and only for her, and which she had been accumulating instances of for a full year. It lost the last of its architecture. The controlled bearing, the measured expression, all of it simply fell away, and what was left underneath was a man looking at the person he loved, with the specific, devastating, completely ordinary clarity of feeling that has nowhere left to hide and has stopped trying. He was not weeping, he was close. She walked toward him through the freesia-scented light, in the city where both their histories were contained in ways they were still in the process of discovering. And she thought about all of it. About the fog on the November morning that had started this. About the cemetery and the kneeling figure and the 2 tracks of moisture on a face that had practiced being still for so long it had nearly forgotten how to stop. About envelopes of cash and orchids in north-facing windows, and Matteo arriving uninvited and the olive cutting in the east window of her shop. About quiet, about gravity, about the life that assembles itself around you when you stop looking away. She reached him. He took her hands. "The flowers are exactly right," he said, and the words were the same words from the cemetery. The first words he had ever said to her, work. And she understood that this was intentional, that he had been holding them for this moment. "They always are," she said, "if you choose them with the right intention." He smiled, fully, in the way that had started in November as almost a smile, and had been becoming degree by degree over a year of mornings and evenings and the patient accumulation of ordinary, extraordinary moments. Something that reached all the way through him. The priest began to speak. Outside, Turin did what it always did. It continued, indifferent and beautiful. Its arcades and its piazzas and its river and its mountains and its long history of complicated people finding ways to build their lives inside the complications. The fog was on the river. The cafes were doing their morning percussion of espresso machines. The chestnut trees along the colonnades were bare and dignified in the way of trees that know they will be extravagant again. Inside, in the freesia-scented church on the oldest street in the city, 2 people who had found each other at a grave in November fog made the specific, uncalculated, irreversible decision to mean it. The shop had a new window in January. Not a physical new window. The narrow face of fiori di sera between the jeweller and the bakery was unchanged. The same glass, the same slight unevenness from the 1950s renovation that gave the view from inside a quality of being slightly underwater. What was new was the arrangement in it. which Valentina changed every Monday, and which had been, for the past 3 months, unmistakably different from what it had been before. Fuller, more confident. The arrangements of someone who was building something rather than maintaining it. Julia had noticed. She noticed everything. This was, Valentina had come to believe, both Julia's greatest professional asset and her defining personal characteristic. And the shop was better for it. She had also developed over the past year an entirely unambiguous opinion about Luca Ferrante, which was that he was, and she had used this word once in Valentina's presence with full awareness of its weight, good. Not simple, not uncomplicated, but good, in the specific way of people who had been given many opportunities not to be, and had made the harder choice anyway. The olive cutting had taken. It stood now in a ceramic pot by the east window, small and certain, its first new leaves a particular translucent green that meant it had decided to stay. Luca had seen it on his first visit after the wedding. He came to the shop now openly, without the circumspection of the early months, which was its own kind of public declaration, and had stood looking at it with an expression she recognized. "It took," he said. "Yes." She handed him a cup of espresso. "They do that when the conditions are right." He looked at it for a moment longer. "My grandmother would have said the soil here is good." "Tell me about her," she said. He sat down on the stool by the work table, her stool, the one he'd been sitting on in the back room the morning he came after the Caruso situation, the morning she'd held him, and he'd held her, and he'd told her about his father wanting to come to the shop when Luca was 17, and refusing, and he talked about his grandmother for 20 minutes. About her voice, which had been low and specific, and had the quality of things that have been thought through before being spoken. About her hands, which had made things, bread, gardens, order in difficult circumstances, with the same matter-of-fact efficiency. About the way she had talked about il mestiere, not as sin or as necessity, but as simply the world she had been given. And about the difference between the world you're given and the world you build inside it. Valentina worked while he talked, which was a thing she'd discovered early. He talked more when her hands were busy, when she was doing rather than listening. She had the theory that it was easier for him to say things when the attention in the room was slightly deflected, the way certain flowers needed less light than full sun, the way some things grew better when you didn't stand over them watching. "She would have come to the wedding if she'd been alive," he said at the end. "I know. She would have told you that you were a sensible girl." He paused, with terrible judgment. Valentina laughed, genuinely, the way she laughed with him, which was different from how she laughed with anyone else, freer, less managed, the laugh of someone who had stopped keeping anything in reserve. "High praise." "From her," he said. "Yes, she had very specific criteria." She set down the flowers she was conditioning and looked at him across the work table. In the January light of the shop, with the olive cutting in its pot, and the freesia in the standing arrangement, and the familiar smell of green things and coffee, he looked, she searched for the word, not different from the man who had walked in on a foggy November morning with an unusual request and an envelope of cash. The same bones, the same controlled bearing, the same hands. But underneath it, something had changed in the quality of the stillness. It was no longer the stillness of a man holding himself together against pressure. It was the stillness of a man who had found his center of gravity and no longer had to maintain it by force. It was the stillness of someone who was, in the specific and underrated sense, at home. He was at rest, in some specific, hard-won, particular way. Not soft, not careless. He would never be those things. The bones of him were not made for them. But at rest in the precise way that came from knowing where you stood and having chosen to stand there. "What?" he said, catching her looking. "Nothing," she said. "Just you." He held her gaze for a moment, in the way she had come to understand meant he was feeling something he was still, after all this time, only moderately competent at expressing in words. This was fine. She had never needed him to be fluent in the language of easy feeling. She was fluent enough for both of them in that language. And he had his own, which she had been learning since November. The language of photographs sent at midnight, of orchids moved toward light, of hands that held carefully, of 4 minutes promised and kept. "The orchid has a new leaf," he said, which she had come to understand as his particular dialect of the same thing, the dialect of a man who showed the state of his interior through the state of the living things in his care. "Good," she said. "It's decided to stay." "Yes," he said, "so it has." Outside, Turin moved through its January. The fog was on the river. The colonnades were doing their ancient, patient work of sheltering people from weather. The piazzas held their cold light. The Alps to the west were fully white and entirely certain of themselves. Inside the narrow shop, the language of flowers continued its quiet, specific work. In November, the 2nd November, she received a commission for a funeral arrangement. This was not unusual. She had been receiving funeral commissions for 22 years, in the ordinary course of her work, the ordinary movement of grief through the city. It was only this one that arrived as it did. Cash in an envelope, no name, an address she needed to find herself, a request for personal delivery. She stood at her counter holding the envelope and felt time bend slightly. The address was different, a cemetery she had never delivered to before, across the city. And the handwriting was different, the hand of someone she had never seen. The amount in the envelope was appropriate, nothing extraordinary, an ordinary commission from an unknown source. And yet... She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, feeling how the year had turned, a full circle, the shop and the fog and the olive cutting in the east window, and the woman she had been and the woman she was now, and all the distance between them that was also no distance at all. She made the arrangement herself. She spent the morning on it, lilies for strength, dark roses for a life that had chosen its own course and committed to it without apology. Evergreen for permanence, for the things that outlast us, the things we leave behind that continue. And an olive branch. She always added the olive branch now for every funeral arrangement she made, the element she had first chosen in November of the previous year for a man whose name she hadn't known yet, standing at her work table, with his grief before him and hers still in its ordinary shape. For peace, even for lives that didn't know much of it. She delivered it herself, driving out through the November morning in her white van, the arrangement in its padded carrier in the back, the radio playing something classical. The fog was on the city in the particular way of November fog, soft and purposeful, moving the way certain kinds of grief move, finding the low places, softening the edges of things. She set the arrangement against the stone with care, and straightened and stood for a moment in the familiar cold, reading the name she didn't recognize and thinking about the person it described, the particular life that had required, from someone still living, a morning's work in the language of flowers. She thought about her father, about Antonio Ferrante, who had operated in the complicated machinery of things and at the end decided to show the human part. About her grandmother, Carla, who had opened a flower shop in 1978 and had believed without hesitation that flowers were a language and that this language mattered and that the people who received it at funerals, at births, at the ordinary occasions of love and grief, understood in some register that bypassed the need for explication that they were being spoken to. She thought about what the language said, always, underneath the specific vocabulary of any given arrangement. Here was a life. It had weight. It mattered. Someone mourns it. She drove back to the shop. Luca was there when she arrived. He had a key. He used it when she expected him and occasionally when he simply wanted to be there, which she had never objected to. Sitting at her work table with a book open in front of him and the olive cutting catching the morning light behind him. And Julia was telling him something about the Tuesday delivery, with the competent animation of someone who had long since stopped being even slightly intimidated by the man her employer had married. He looked up when she came in. "How was it?" he asked. "Good," she said. She took off her coat, hung it on the hook behind the door. "The olive branch was right," he nodded. He had stopped asking about the funerals in the specific sense, about who, about where, about the circumstances, because he had come to understand, as she had always known, that the funeral was not really the point. The arrangement was the point. The language was the point. The choice to say something true about a life in the vocabulary of things that grew and died and were cut and made beautiful by that cutting. That was the point. She went to the work table and looked at what he was reading. History, Roman history, a translation of Livy she hadn't seen before. And she stood beside him, and he moved the book slightly to make room for her elbow on the table, a gesture so small and so entirely habitual that she was certain he wasn't aware of making it, the way people stop being aware of the things they have done long enough to consider natural. This was the thing. Not the penthouse, or the Monferrato Hills, or the nightclub, or the private cemetery, or the 48 hours when she hadn't heard from him and had learned, definitively, what waiting felt like, when the thing you were waiting for was specific and irreplaceable. Not those things, or not only those things. This. A Tuesday morning in January, in a narrow shop between a jeweller and a bakery, his elbow making room for hers on a work table worn smooth by 20 years of arranging things into sentences. The fact that the most dangerous people sometimes also carried the deepest grief was something her grandmother had known before she did. The fact that the deepest grief was often the beginning of something rather than only the end of it, that she had learned herself in a November cemetery, standing still when everything in her training told her to move. The flowers continued their patient work around them, breathing their green, living breath, holding the frequencies that made rooms quiet, speaking their accumulated language of comfort and celebration and the irreducible weight of a life. Julia finished her inventory report to Luca and picked up her coat. "I'm doing the morning delivery," she said, "back by 11. "The Colombo order?" Valentina asked. "And the Bianchi birthday, yes." She paused at the door, looked at the two of them at the work table, said nothing, because nothing needed saying. The door chimed, and she was gone. The shop was quiet. Luca turned a page of his Livy. Valentina began an arrangement. Tuesday, The sunflower woman was coming. She always came on Tuesdays, and her hands moved in the familiar way, reaching for the right stems, making the right cuts, the language assembling itself as it always had and always would, through every November and every spring and every ordinary, extraordinary Tuesday morning that came after. The olive cutting was green and certain in its pot by the east window. The city went about its business. The fog was burning off over the Po. Somewhere in a cemetery on the southern edge of Turin, in a private section where certain families kept certain histories, the lilies she had left were already turning their architectural faces toward the light. Here was a life. It had weight. It mattered. And it continued, the way the best things continued, not loudly, not with drama, not with the visible effort of things that must announce themselves to be believed, but quietly, in the specific language of a woman who had spent her life learning to say true things with flowers, and a man who had spent his life learning that the truest things were the ones you had not planned to feel. Quiet, specific, alive. Flowers are the alphabet of grief, the vocabulary of love, and the grammar of everything in between. Carla Greco, 1934 to 2021.